Absolutely not.
Margaret Cole set her wine glass down with the precision of a woman who had already decided the conversation was over, her fingers resting against the stem like a judge placing a gavel. She is my friend, Ethan. Mother. She is older than you. Each word landed separately, deliberate and loaded. People will laugh at this family. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? They will laugh at us. The dining room had never felt smaller, the chandelier casting warm gold over a table set for two, half-eaten desserts pushed aside, the evening collapsing into something neither of them had planned. Outside the tall windows, the city sparkled without concern. Ethan didn't flinch, didn't pace, didn't reach for his wine. He stood at the end of the table with his hands in his pockets, watching his mother with eyes that had taken 32 years to get that calm. I love her, Mother. Margaret stared at him. For a woman who had buried her husband and walked back into boardrooms 3 weeks later wearing Chanel and a jaw made of iron, this was the first time in recent memory that she had absolutely nothing to say. The grandfather clock ticked loudly into the silence. Then she picked up her glass, took a long, slow sip, and said with magnificent composure, "You need to leave my house." He drove for 40 minutes without a destination, the city sliding past in streaks of amber and neon, his hands loose on the wheel of the black Porsche his mother had gifted him on his 30th birthday, back when the biggest problem between them was that he worked too many Saturdays. At a red light, he picked up his phone and called Vanessa. She answered on the second ring, unhurried, as if she always had time. How did it go? Warm voice, carefully held, like someone carrying a full cup. Ethan exhaled slowly. She told me to leave her house. A beat of quiet, and then softly, "Oh, Ethan. She'll come around. You keep saying that." "Because I keep meaning it." He heard her breathe, heard the faint Miles Davis record she kept on whenever she was untangling something complicated, and felt something settle in his chest the way it always did when her world came through the phone, small and real and unhurried. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I know," she replied, even more quietly. He drove. She stayed on the line. Neither of them needed anything else. 8 months earlier, Ethan had attended his mother's parties his entire life with the same expression, politely present, privately counting minutes. He had mastered small talk with senators, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, and deflected compliments about his father's legacy with practiced grace. He was making his way toward the bar at the spring celebration when he walked through the archway and stopped. Not paused. Not hesitated. Stopped. She stood near the fireplace in an emerald dress that didn't try too hard and didn't need to, speaking with one of his mother's colleagues with the posture of someone genuinely interested, not performing it. Head tilted slightly, a small smile moving at the corner of her mouth. She hadn't noticed him yet. She was striking the way certain things are striking, a skyline at dusk, a sentence in a book that arrests you mid-page, not because it announces itself, but simply because it is completely and without apology. Then she glanced up. Their eyes met. Something happened in Ethan's chest that had never happened before, and he was irritated enough by it that he walked straight to the bar and ordered scotch. His mother materialized at his elbow 45 seconds later, which told him she'd been watching. "You're staring," Margaret said pleasantly. "I'm not staring. Darling, I've known you 32 years. You were staring." She sipped her champagne. "That is Vanessa Reed. We went to Oxford together. She owns 4 fashion houses. She's just returned from Milan, and she is absolutely not someone you should pursue." He looked at her. "Did I say anything about pursuing anyone?" "Your face did." She patted his arm and glided away. He lasted 11 minutes before he introduced himself. "You're Margaret's son," Vanessa said, and her voice matched everything else about her, measured and warm, with a quiet undercurrent of amusement. "Guilty," he said. "Ethan Cole. And you're Vanessa Reed for fashion houses, just back from Milan, and apparently I'm not supposed to be talking to you." She blinked, surprised, and then laughed, a real laugh, nothing cocktail party about it, and the sound of it did something thoroughly unfair to his composure. "She warned you off already? I've been in the country 4 hours. My mother is very efficient. She really is." Vanessa looked across the room at Margaret with fond, long-suffering exasperation. "We were roommates at Oxford. She reorganized my wardrobe while I slept. Said my system was inefficient." "Was it?" "Objectively, yes. But I was 20 and deeply attached to my chaos, so." She made a small gesture that communicated an entire philosophy of personal freedom. Ethan smiled without planning to. "Can I get you another drink?" he asked. She looked at her glass, still nearly full, then back at him with eyes that weighed things accurately and without drama. "All right," she said. They talked for 2 hours. Not flirtatiously, not in the careful circling way of people performing attraction at a party, but genuinely, at the comfortable speed of two people relieved to find someone thinking at a similar pace. She told him about a Tuscan textile family making the same silk for 4 generations, whose granddaughter was about to go synthetic. He told her about an East Side development stalled because every community stakeholder had valid concerns, and he couldn't stop listening, even though it was wrecking the timeline. "Your father built the company without much listening, from what I remember," she said, not unkindly. "He built it fast," Ethan replied. "I'm trying to build it to last." She considered this, no flattering agreement, actual consideration. "That's the more interesting goal," she said. His mother appeared with a determined smile and swept Vanessa away to meet someone. Vanessa left with a clean, brief smile in his direction, nothing loaded, nothing performed. He watched her cross the room. He realized with the mild alarm of a man who had been entirely comfortable for 32 years in trouble. He got her number through a mutual contact, after 2 days of deliberating, and then the rather obvious conclusion that he had thought about a party conversation for 48 consecutive hours, which settled the matter entirely. She answered on the 3rd ring. "I wondered when you'd call," she said. "You expected me to?" "I expected you to think about it for at least 2 days first." A pause. "Was it 2 days?" Silence. "It was 2 days," she said, with quiet satisfaction. "I want to take you to dinner," he said, because there was no version of this conversation in which his dignity was salvageable, so directness was the only option remaining. Silence on the line. The thinking kind. "I should say no," she said. But I've been thinking about that conversation for 2 days as well, so." Another pause. "Thursday. 7 o'clock. And I'm choosing the restaurant." "Absolutely. Good. I don't trust men who need to control the reservation." He laughed before he could stop himself. She chose a small Italian place in the arts district with no velvet ropes, and no one in it trying to be seen, just good wine, handmade pasta, and tables close enough that everything felt like a confidence. He arrived first and discovered, with some displeasure, that he was nervous. She arrived 3 minutes later in a dark burgundy coat, and the nerves evaporated the moment she sat down, ordered wine without hesitation, asked him 2 questions before the bread arrived, and within 15 minutes they were mid-conversation, not beginning one, resuming one, as though there had always been more to say. "Tell me something you don't tell people at parties," she said. He considered it honestly. "I almost didn't take over the company. After my father died, I spent 6 months asking myself if I actually wanted it. Everyone assumed I'd step in. The board, my mother, the entire city." He turned his wine glass slowly. "I needed to choose it myself. There's a difference." She nodded, and he could tell she understood the difference precisely. "Your turn," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I was relieved when my marriage ended. Not immediately. I was devastated first, furious first. But underneath all of that, even at the beginning, there was relief." She looked at him steadily. "We'd been wrong for each other for years, and neither of us was brave enough to say so." "How long?" 9 years. "That's a long time to know something and not say it." "People do it constantly," she said simply. The food arrived, the conversation moved, but Ethan held her answer carefully in the back of his mind, and found he respected the honesty of it more than any easier version would have deserved. Dinner became a walk along the river because neither of them was ready to stop, which neither announced. It simply happened, her coat buttoned against the cool air, his hands in his pockets, the city shimmering on the dark water below. "My mother is going to be catastrophically disapproving of this," he said. "I know." She wasn't distressed by it. "Margaret has always had strong opinions about appropriate categories. Does it bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "Ask me again in a few months. When there's more to be bothered about." "When?" "Not if. Just when," stated plainly, a quiet assumption of continued motion. He walked her to her car. She turned to look at him with that steady, unperformed attention he was already learning was simply how she engaged with everything. "I had a very good time," she said. "So did I." She nodded once, as if confirming something expected, got in her car, and drove away. He stood on the pavement until the tail lights disappeared. Then he stood there a moment longer. Then he walked back to his own car, and he was still smiling when he reached. Ethan Cole had grown up in the particular loneliness of having everything. His father, Richard, had been a man of tremendous force and limited warmth, who showed love through provision rather than presence, who attended school events in a suit and left early, who wrote praise on report cards in handwriting so formal it looked typeset. When he died, Ethan discovered that grief and love are not always the same thing, that you can mourn someone deeply and simultaneously realize you never quite knew them, and that the second loss is somehow heavier than the first. He had thrown himself into the company with something that looked like dedication and was partly avoidance, building with steadiness and care, quietly having a conversation with his absent father through every project. He had dated, because he was 32 and women were interested, but there had always been a particular absence in those relationships, like a room where the acoustics were wrong. Sound went in, and nothing came back quite right. He had never told anyone this. He told Vanessa on their fourth dinner, surprised to find the words already leaving before he'd decided to say them, and she listened without interrupting, without performing sympathy, just listened with her full attention, and then said, "You've been looking for someone who thinks at the same speed you do. It's not complicated. It just makes the search longer." He sat with that, and it had the quiet satisfaction of something true. Vanessa Reed had built herself carefully, and at some cost. She'd grown up with a mother who sewed from the front room, and a father who drove long-distance trucks. Both of them practical people who loved her completely and understood almost nothing about what she actually was. What she was from about age 14 was someone for whom beauty was a serious language, not vanity, language, a system of meaning as complex as mathematics, and about as respected by her immediate world. She'd gotten to Oxford on scholarship, studied economics because it was practical, taken every design course available because it was necessary, and graduated into a fashion industry that was glamorous on the surface and brutal underneath. Her marriage to David Reed had ended after 9 years not because of cruelty, but because of the quieter failure of two people who changed and didn't change together. She didn't hate him. She understood the human ordinariness of it too well to sustain anger. What she came out of it with was a clear understanding of what she would not accept again, which turned out to be the most useful thing she had ever learned. She was 42, owned 4 fashion houses, had an apartment full of books and one magnificently opinionated cat named Giacomo, and she had been entirely satisfied with her life. She had not been expecting Ethan Cole. Margaret Cole was the kind of woman who rearranged a room simply by entering it. She had married Richard because they were equally matched, two people who both needed to be the smartest person present and had decided to be that together. When he died, she grieved privately and functioned publicly, the only way she knew how to survive, and she walked into a boardroom full of men who expected to absorb the Cole business and said, with perfect pleasantness, "Gentlemen, I'll be taking it from here." It took 2 years for them to stop testing her, another 2 for them to respect her. She hadn't wasted a moment of either period seeking their approval. This was the thing her opposition in the matter of Vanessa entirely missed. She was not a hypocrite out of malice. She was a hypocrite out of habit, the long human tendency to fight for your own freedom and then build fences around everyone else's, not from cruelty, but because freedom, once you've bled for it, starts to feel like a limited resource. She would understand this eventually, but first it would cost her something. When charm didn't work, Margaret moved to strategy. She invited Vanessa to lunch, 3 weeks after Ethan told her, and slid an envelope across the white tablecloth between the bread basket and the mineral water, her expression pleasant, her posture immaculate. Vanessa looked at the envelope without touching it. "How much?" she asked. "Enough that you wouldn't need to work for 2 years. Vanessa picked up her water glass, took a calm sip, and set it down. "Margaret, we have been friends for 20 years. Which is why I'm doing this quietly." "You're doing this," Vanessa said, with the measured precision of someone choosing each word like a careful step, "because you are frightened, and I understand that. But this," she pushed the envelope back across the table, "is not something I'll accept from you or from anyone." She left lunch early. She did not call Ethan about it. He found out anyway, because Margaret, in her frustration, made the mistake of telling her assistant, and assistants in their circle talked, and the city was smaller than it looked. He called his mother. "You offered her money," he said when she picked up, his voice quiet and even, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. "Ethan, you offered the woman I love money to leave me." A beat of silence. "I need you to understand what you've just done to us." He hung up. Margaret sat in her office with the phone in her hand for a long time. She tried other things after that, because Margaret Cole did not stop at the first obstacle, It was both her greatest strength and, in this particular matter, her most catastrophic flaw. She introduced younger women to Ethan at 3 separate events. He was pleasant to all of them and forgot their names by the time he reached his car. She quietly shared details of Vanessa's divorce with 2 journalists she trusted, framing it as concern, dressing it in the language of protection. The story ran on a Thursday morning. Fashion executive's secret failed marriage, the woman pursuing city's most eligible heir. Vanessa saw it on her phone while she was having coffee, alone in her apartment, Giacomo on the chair beside her. She read it once, set the phone face down on the table, and sat very still for several minutes. Then she called Ethan. "I need to see you," she said. He was at her apartment within 20 minutes. She opened the door in the clothes she'd been wearing, no performance, no preparation, and he could see from her eyes that she had been crying. Not recently, but she had, which was the only time he had ever seen it, and it did something to his chest that he did not have words for. "Come in," she said quietly. He came in. She sat on the couch, he sat beside her, and she told him what she'd decided, her voice steady and her hands still in her lap, the way she did everything, completely. "Your mother will not stop," she said. "I knew that when we started, and I chose it anyway, because you were worth choosing. But I cannot be the reason your family breaks. I cannot be the person your mother looks at every Christmas for the next 20 years and feels like she lost. Vanessa, let me finish." She looked at him. "You deserve someone your mother can love. I want that for you, even if it isn't me." The apartment was very quiet. "Are you done?" he said. She blinked. "Because I've been listening very carefully," he continued, in the same even voice he used when something mattered enormously and he refused to let it make him loud. "And what I'm hearing is that you're making a decision about my life on my behalf. And I need you to know that I don't accept it. Ethan, your mother." "My mother," he said, "is my problem, not yours." He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and he held it the way you hold something you are not going to put down. "Give me 1 week." She looked at him for a long time. 1 week, she said finally. The Cole family gathered monthly for what Margaret called a business dinner, and everyone else privately called a formal endurance exercise. 12 family members around a long table, 3 courses, and the particular tension of people who loved each other and were also always slightly in competition. Ethan arrived late, which was unusual enough that heads turned. He sat down, accepted his wine, made small talk through the starter, and then, when the main course arrived and the table settled into that comfortable post-starter rhythm, he set down his fork and spoke. "I want to say something, and I'm going to ask everyone to let me finish." The table went quiet. Margaret, at the head, went very still. "You taught me," he said, looking at her directly, "that the opinion of a room full of people who don't know you is worth exactly nothing. You taught me that when they said you couldn't run this company, when they said a widow with no experience should step aside, when they laughed in boardrooms and wrote things in papers." He paused. "You told me you looked at every single one of them and built something they could not ignore." No one at the table moved. "You taught me to fight for what matters," Ethan continued. "And now you're asking me to abandon the woman I love because of society's opinion." He held his mother's gaze. "Help me understand how those 2 things live in the same person." The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked. Margaret's face moved through several things at once, pride and pain and fury, and something older than all 3. She stood up, placed her napkin on the table with great care, and walked out of the. 3 days later, Vanessa opened her door to find Margaret Cole standing in the hallway with no assistant, no driver visible, no armor of occasion. Just a woman in a gray coat, looking slightly smaller than her reputation. "May I come in?" Margaret asked. Vanessa stepped aside. They sat in the living room with tea neither of them drank, Giacomo making a brief and suspicious inspection of the visitor before withdrawing to his chair with the air of someone reserving judgment. Margaret looked around the apartment, at the books stacked on every surface, the fabric samples pinned to a board by the window, the single orchid on the kitchen counter, and something in her expression shifted into something more honest. "When Richard died," she began, without preamble, "and I walked into that boardroom, there was a man there, Gerald Harmon, you may know the name, who stood up and said that the company deserved leadership, not sentiment. In front of everyone." She looked at her hands. "I had been awake for 3 days. I had just buried my husband. And I stood there and I smiled at Gerald Harmon and I said, 'Quite right. Let's begin.'" Vanessa waited. "People said I was cold," Margaret continued. "They said I was calculating, that I cared more about the business than about my grief, that I was not a real woman, not a real widow, because real widows fell apart. Her jaw tightened briefly. I spent 10 years fighting that characterization. 10 years of people deciding who I was from the outside. She looked up. And I have spent the last 8 months, she said, doing the exact same thing to you. The apartment was very quiet. I am not asking you to forgive me quickly, Margaret said, and her voice, for the first time Vanessa could remember in 20 years, carried something undefended. I am asking you to believe that I see it, and that I'm sorry, and that my son, she paused, loves you in a way I recognize, because it's the way his father loved me, and I wasted months trying to kill it. Vanessa looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached over, picked up both cups of tea, handed one to Margaret, and said, "Drink your tea. It's getting cold." Margaret looked at the cup. Then, for the first time in a very long time, Margaret Cole laughed, genuinely and helplessly, and Vanessa smiled, and Giacomo watched them both from his chair with an expression of profound feline suspicion. People talked, of course. They talked about the age difference, about the optics, about the Cole family blessing a match that broke 4 unspoken social rules. They talked in the way people always talk when other people's lives do not conform to the shape they've decided happiness should be. On a Saturday in early October, none of it was audible inside the venue. Margaret sat in the front row in dove-gray silk, watching her son stand at the altar with the straight-backed stillness of a man who had arrived somewhere he intended to stay, and she felt the tight, complicated thing in her chest, the one she'd been carrying for 8 months, finally release. The doors opened. Vanessa walked in wearing ivory, unhurried as always, carrying herself with the complete ease of someone who had already decided, long before this room, long before this moment, exactly who she was. Ethan watched her walk toward him. The guests, the flowers, the string quartet, the city and its opinions, all of it went to a pleasant and irrelevant distance. She reached him. "Hello," she said quietly, which was not in any script. "Hello," he said back, equally quietly, and she smiled at him the way she had smiled that first night in the restaurant, real and unperformed and entirely for him. And he thought, with the clarity of someone who has waited a long time for something obvious, there it is. 3 years later, Margaret's garden in late afternoon, 2 small children demolishing the hydrangeas with the focused commitment of people who have identified a very good activity. Ethan sat on the steps watching them with the unhurried ease of a man who had learned that some things could not be rushed and were better for it. Vanessa came out of the house carrying 2 glasses of lemonade, handed him one, and sat beside him on the step, close enough that their shoulders touched. Margaret, in her garden chair with a sun hat that had seen better decades, watched her grandchildren create botanical chaos, and felt something she had nearly bargained away. "Amma," one of the twins bellowed at her. "The flowers are broken." "Yes, I can see that," Margaret said. "Did you break them?" The child considered this with the diplomatic instincts of someone very small. "The wind did it." "Did it?" "Yes." "I see." Margaret looked at the flower in his fist. "Bring me the evidence." He toddled over importantly and deposited a crushed hydrangea in her palm. She looked at it for a moment, and then looked up at her son, who was watching her with a smile she recognized as his father's, and beyond him at Vanessa, who was watching the garden with that quiet, attentive peace of someone who had chosen everything in her life deliberately and was not surprised that it felt good. Margaret closed her fingers around the small flower. "Love truly chooses its own timing," she said softly, to no one in particular. The afternoon continued. The children ran. Everyone, without performance and without announcement, was happy. End.